Today is day 2 of the Big Teach-In. This is November 6th, day 37 of Occupy Los Angeles, and you're watching Inside Out News.
They managed to do a very weak bill last year that only protected net neutrality for the wired internet. And right now, everybody, including most of the people in the Occupy movement, are using a wireless internet. What this would mean if we lost these protections is these major corporations would gain control. They would be able to charge for access, and the big companies like Google and AOL would be able to pay for it. But the small people, they would slow us down, they would block us, they would create all sorts of interference, and we would no longer be able to challenge the mainstream media. We would no longer have our local voices. And it is very important, on Tuesday there is going to be in the Senate a resolution of disapproval, which we need to make sure it is defeated. Because the Republicans want to get rid of all net neutrality, including these weak regulations that pass. And we've got to hold the FCC and Obama accountable.
Today's teach-in included panels on organizing and civil disobedience, sustainable living, and corporatocracy. The occupation got a surprise visit from Bill Maher of Real Time with Bill Maher on HBO. He walked through the encampment and took a lot of questions from the occupiers. We were able to get in a few questions ourselves, and here's what Mr. Maher had to say.
What do you think is a solution that the occupation movement can aim toward in terms of bringing in the bankers and finding justice? Since it seems like there's not a lot of strong prosecution going on right now, there's been investigations that rather lead to immunity than anything else.
Well, prosecution probably isn't the avenue that's going to get a lot of change done. The problem is that what they did was legal. That was the scandal, is that they weren't breaking the law. The problem happened back in the 90s when they got rid of Glass-Steagall and some other things that separated traditional, old-school, boring banking from the kind of exotic banking that went on, and where they turned basically Wall Street into an Indian casino. So, yeah. That's the scandal. The scandal is what's legal, not what's illegal.
And in terms of Citizens United, do you think that people actually have a chance to actually make change, considering that the legal issue is that corporations are considered people and have the right to donate so much money without any type of check and balance?
I was saying this to my friend earlier also, that if we were doing a page 1 rewrite of the Constitution, I think I said this on the show last night. One of the first things we would get rid of would be this ridiculous notion that corporations are people. Mm-hmm. They're not people, they're sharks. Sharks aren't people.
We spoke with 2 members of the panels from the teach-in today. The first is David DeGraw. DeGraw is credited with creating the 99% movement and is the publisher of ampstatus.org. We talked with him a bit about the origins of the movement, where the movement is going, and if he had any solutions for the current financial crisis in the United States.
Crisis throughout the United States, the explosion of poverty, underreporting, unemployment, and I focused on, economic inequality, and I discovered that the gap between the richest 1% and the remaining 99% of the population was the most severe it's ever been in the history of the United States. I also discovered that the 400 richest Americans have as much wealth as half the U.S. population. So you have 400 people making as much as 154 million Americans. So basically, over a 35-year period, there was massive wealth creation, but 99% of the U.S. population didn't see that. Their wages remained stagnant. All that massive wealth creation went to the top 1%. And I also broke it down saying that U.S. millionaire households have a total of $46 trillion in wealth. And if you break it down even further, only 1/10 of 1% of the population makes over $1 million a year. So you have this very small segment of the population that has just run away with the wealth. So, I kept putting forth this theory that 99% of the population needed to unite from, all different political perspectives. We needed to unite on common ground to take on these global financial interests, the economic elites that have seized control of our government through what I call a system of political bribery, which is campaign finance, lobbying, and the revolving door between Washington and Wall Street. They've basically bought control of the government, not just the U.S. government, but Egypt, Tunisia, Greece, Ireland, Italy, Spain, all throughout the world. They've bought off these governments. So we need to unite on common ground to take on these global financial interests. And what you asked about with the attacks on the website, when the 99% movement started to take off online, our website was getting attacked with DDoS attacks, and then they kept escalating, and then they took out our entire ISP network, which affected a whole bunch of hundreds of other websites. So we were put in a position where our hosting company didn't want to host us anymore. So we were in trouble. We didn't have enough money to have this expensive system. So members of Anonymous approached us, and they helped set us up with a new hosting system, and they eventually collaborated with the 99% movement. We formed this A99 group, and they were the ones that pushed for this June 14th protest, which was like a precursor to the September 17th protest. So Anonymous really stepped up and saved us in a big way. I mean, we would have, basically been knocked off the internet if it wasn't for them.
What do you think about recently Anonymous calling for the creation of a 99% political party?
I've seen this. I don't know who exactly is behind it, but it's interesting. I mean, people have strong opinions on it. A lot of people don't want anything to do with the political process. Some people want a political party, but generally speaking, I would like to see a 99% party of some kind, personally speaking. It would be interesting. There's certainly enough momentum for it now. And look, both the Democratic and Republican parties have been completely sold out to the, top 1%, and they're not representing 99% of the population. In fact, I said that in that report where I called for the 99%, I said that 99% of the U.S. population has lost political representation. I totally believe that. The statistics, 94% of the time, the candidate who spends more money on their campaign wins the election. So whoever gets the most money wins the election. So it's a rigged system. It's been rigged against hardworking Americans, and we need to unite and find common ground. And we had an online process where thousands of people issued their own demands, and it basically came down to two things that we felt people from across the political spectrum agreed on, and that was getting money out of politics, like I said, the system of political bribery with campaign finance, lobbying. The other one was breaking up the banks, these so-called too-big-to-fail banks. They're so large, they have so much wealth, you just can't contain them, you can't really fight back against them, so we need to break them up. There was an amendment, a Brown-Kaufman amendment that was put forth last year to break up the banks, which failed to make it through Senate. But certain legislation like that we should definitely be pushing for. And these are first steps, obviously. It's not our ultimate goal, but we got to walk before we can run, and breaking up these banks and trying to limit the influence of money in politics needs to be done, and that's something everyone can agree on if you're not already a billionaire.
And what is the ultimate goal?
I mean, the ultimate goal would be a political system that is not rigged by elite economic interests. I don't really have an end game. I don't really subscribe to any one ideology. I just want there to be accountability. I want the rule of law to apply to everyone in this country. And, so getting money, making a level playing field. So everyone has a fair shot, fair say. I guess that's ultimately what we're after.
Our second interview is with Derek Cressman of Common Cause. He's the director for the campaign to reverse Citizens United. He was on the corporatocracy panel this afternoon. We had a chance to talk to him a bit about campaign finance reform and the fight to end Citizens United. I was talking to William Black yesterday. He's an economist, and I was asking him a bit about Citizens United, and he seemed to think he seemed to be optimistic on it, saying it was a 5-4 ruling, and that because it was so split, that there's really a good chance at repeal. What do you see realistically in that regard of actually repealing or passing another law to overturn Citizens United? What's your outlook on that?
Well, there are two ways to change a wrong-headed Supreme Court ruling. We can't just pass another law because that would the current court would still consider that unconstitutional. But you're right that it was a very controversial ruling in a very divided court, 5 votes to 4. So one way that it could change is one of those 5 justices could leave the court. They could retire, they could die, they could be replaced by a different justice who did not think that corporations deserved the rights of citizenship and did not think that money was speech, and the vote would change and it'd be 4 to 5, and a new case could come up and that would reverse the ruling. And if that happens, it's great, but that's not something that we the people can make happen. That's not within the power of the Occupy movement to demand now. And the problem is, it could also go back the other way in 10 or 20 years. It's not necessarily a permanent solution. So I think the best way to go about it is to pass a constitutional amendment, which then clarifies for the court, no, money is not speech. Corporations do not have the same constitutional rights that citizens do. And this has been done 27 times in our history. Sometimes the 11th Amendment was passed actually directly to reverse a Supreme Court ruling that the people thought was wrong way back at our founding times. So that's the process that we need to take on, and it's a difficult one. We need 2/3 of the Congress to propose an amendment, and then 3/4 of the state legislatures need to ratify it.
Have you heard about a couple of Democrats in I think it was in the Senate, they had proposed an actual constitutional amendment just this last week. Have you heard a bit about that?
I have. There have actually been a number of constitutional amendments introduced in the Congress, really some going back 10 or 20 years, but one that's gathered a lot of attention was last week. Senator Udall from New Mexico introduced an amendment. There are 10 senators who've co-sponsored that, so that's a significant amount of momentum. And it is aimed at reversing the Buckley versus Vallejo ruling that basically said money is the same thing as free speech, and so the Koch brothers or anybody else can spend as much money as they want to, even if that drowns out the voices of ordinary citizens.
Now, that was a ruling in the 70s, is that correct?
Yeah, 1976 is when that ruling came down. So Senator Udall's amendment would authorize the Congress and the states to pass just basic rules on campaign finance, setting limits on contributions, setting limits on spending, the same sort of common sense stuff that everybody thinks we should have already and may not realize that we can't have it until we change this court ruling.
Now, what about in terms of the McCain-Feingold campaign financing bill that it was a big deal, I guess, in the late 90s, early 2000s? Does that have any the idea of that have any effect now, or at all? In that.
Yeah, what the McCain-Feingold law was about basically was applying contribution limits to political parties, Democratic Party, Republican Party. The lawyers had found loopholes in our campaign finance laws and had found ways of getting around the limits that were in place now. So in the 90s, we saw the Lincoln bedroom being rented out by President Clinton to donors who were giving $100,000. We saw other donors giving $100,000 or $500,000 to the Republican Party. The McCain-Feingold law was aimed at stopping that, and that piece of it is still intact. There are still contribution limits in place to the political parties. But what we've seen in the last couple of years through new Supreme Court rulings, Citizens United and others, is it's basically been gutted, and you now have candidates creating these things called super PACs, right? So all the presidential candidates have these super PACs that are working basically in tandem with these political campaigns, and that's undone a lot of what McCain-Feingold tried to do.
So, in terms of what the occupation can do in regard to Citizens United, what are the actual practical steps that people who are occupying, people who are protesting, what is it that they can do? What kind of action can they take to actually possibly, push Udall's constitutional amendment or other types of constitutional amendments or some type of legislative action? What is it that they can do right now to make that happen?
Well, first, I think the Occupy movement should realize that what it has already done has moved this. The reason we saw 10 U.S. senators supporting a constitutional amendment last week is they've noticed what's going on in the country, and they have seen the Occupy movement, and some of them are starting to feel like they need to do something. So that's incredibly important, and the movement has already made a hugely significant difference. It's not enough. So we need to keep what we're doing. The Occupies need to keep strong. They need to make it through the winter. That needs to keep going. Then more specifically, we should be contacting Congress in every way we can, emails, phone calls, physically showing up, and demanding a constitutional amendment. The Udall Amendment is a place to start, but there are stronger amendments that have been introduced, and we need to have a further dialogue in this country about whether any of them go far enough. Some of them, Udall's in particular, doesn't really tackle this question of whether or not a corporation should have the same rights as you and I do. But Congress is starting to listen, and we are starting to get their attention, so we need to just keep it up.
Occupy Los Angeles is planning a march for Wednesday through the financial district. We'll get more info on that for you later this week. This is Margot Paez signing off for Inside Out News. Good night.